Somewhere behind your eyes, right now, there is a memory forming of the sentence you just read. You would swear, if asked, that a moment ago you were reading the words before this one, and before that, the ones before those, in an unbroken line stretching back through the morning, through last night, through your childhood, through a past you never doubt because doubting it seems insane. But suppose, for a moment, that the universe did not exist 10 minutes ago. Suppose it did not exist 5 minutes ago. Suppose everything, every galaxy, every fossil, every scar on your knee, every memory sitting warm and convincing in your skull came into being in a single instant, 5 minutes in the past, fully formed, complete with the illusion of a history it never had. The light from distant stars would already be mid-flight, having never left them. The bread in your kitchen would already be stale, having never been baked. Your body would carry old injuries it never suffered, and your mind would carry memories of events that never happened, and none of it, not one atom, not one thought, would feel any different from the way it feels right now. This is not a joke, and it is not a thought experiment designed to be dismissed after a moment's uneasy laughter. It is one of the strangest and most stubborn puzzles in the history of philosophy, and its persistence tells you something uncomfortable, that your confidence in the past is not built on evidence in the way you think it is. It is built on something else entirely, something you have never examined because you have never needed to. Until now. The philosopher who gave this puzzle its sharpest form was Bertrand Russell, writing in 1921 almost as an aside in a book about the analysis of mind. He was not trying to unsettle anyone. He was making a technical point about memory and its relationship to the past, and in the course of making that point he tossed off a sentence that has haunted every careful thinker who has encountered it since. He observed that there is no logical impossibility in the hypothesis that the world sprang into being 5 minutes ago, exactly as it then was, with a population that remembered a wholly unreal past. Read that sentence again. There is no logical impossibility. Russell was not saying this was likely. He was not even saying it was worth taking seriously as a live possibility about how the world actually is. He was saying something narrower and in some ways more devastating, that nothing in logic and nothing in the character of your present experience rules it out. You cannot construct a valid argument using only what is available to you right now that concludes with certainty that the world existed before this moment. Every route you might take toward that conclusion turns out, on inspection, to depend on an assumption you have not proven and cannot prove from where you stand. Consider what evidence for the past would even have to look like. You might reach first for memory. I remember eating breakfast this morning, so breakfast this morning must have happened. But notice the structure of that inference. You do not have direct access to breakfast. Breakfast is over. What you have right now, in this present instant, is a mental state, an image, a feeling, a conviction that presents itself as being about a past event. The memory is not a window looking backward through time. It is a thing happening now, in your brain, now, with a certain phenomenal character, now. If the universe had sprung into existence 5 minutes ago, this memory state would be exactly as vivid, exactly as detailed, exactly as convincing, because it would have been created whole, along with everything else, in that instant of cosmic birth. There would be no seam, no discontinuity, no place where the illusion shows its stitching. The memory would not feel different from a real memory because there is no such thing as what a memory feels like from the inside when it is real as opposed to false. Memories do not come stamped with a certificate of authenticity. They come only with a feeling of pastness, a phenomenological flavor that says this happened, and that flavor is generated by the state of your brain right now, not by any causal thread reaching back into an actual yesterday. This is worth sitting with because it is easy to nod along and still not feel the force of it. Try this instead. Close your eyes and recall the last meal you ate. You will get an image, maybe a taste, maybe a location, maybe a fragment of conversation. Ask yourself, what, exactly, are you experiencing right now that could not be experienced by a being whose entire existence began 60 seconds before you closed your eyes? The answer is nothing. Every phenomenal ingredient of the memory, the image, the taste, the sense of familiarity, the feeling that it happened to you could in principle be instantiated in a brain with no actual history at all, a brain built by whatever means to have exactly this internal state and no other. The memory does not carry a signature from its origin. It is, from the inside, indistinguishable from a perfect forgery of itself. And if that is true of one memory, it is true of all of them, which means it is true of your entire remembered life, the whole autobiographical structure you use to answer the question, who am I and where have I been? That structure could be, in its entirety, a 5-minute-old fabrication, and you would have no way of noticing, because noticing would require comparison between the fabrication and the truth, and you have no access to the truth except through more of the very fabrication you are trying to test. This is the trap, and it is worth naming precisely because much of what follows in this exploration will be an attempt to find a way out of it, or at least to understand why we do not feel trapped even though, formally, we are. The trap is this: any piece of evidence you might offer for the reality of the past is itself a present state, a memory, a document, a fossil, a photograph, a scar, and every present state is compatible with two different histories. In the first history, the state was caused by a real chain of past events unfolding over years, centuries, billions of years. In the second history, the state simply came into existence a moment ago, uncaused by any of that, arranged from the start to look exactly as if it had such a history. No observation you make, no matter how careful, can distinguish between these two histories, because the very act of observation happens now, and both histories agree perfectly about what now contains. This is not a failure of your instruments. It is not a failure of your reasoning. It is a structural feature of the situation. The evidence and the fabrication of evidence are, by hypothesis, identical. Notice how different this is from an ordinary case of doubt. If I doubt that it rained last night, I can go outside and check for puddles, wet leaves, a damp smell in the air. These checks work because I trust that puddles are caused by rain, that dampness persists over hours, that the causal order of the world links past rain to present wetness. But the 5-minute hypothesis does not deny any of these causal links. It grants that, in the story it tells, puddles are typically caused by rain. What it denies is that the puddles I see now were caused that way. It says the puddles, the wet leaves, the smell, the memory of the sound of rain on your window last night, all of it appeared 5 minutes ago as a package with the causal history already built into its appearance rather than into any actual causal process. Checking for more evidence does not help because whatever you check will itself be part of the package. You cannot step outside the package to verify it from a neutral vantage point because there is no neutral vantage point. There is only now, and now is compatible with both stories. There is something almost comic about how this puzzle entered the world. Russell was not staging a dramatic confrontation with skepticism when he wrote it down. He was in the middle of a technical discussion about behaviorist psychology, trying to explain why a purely behaviorist account of mind cannot fully capture what memory is, and he reached for an extreme case to illustrate a narrower point about the logical relationship between a memory state and the past event it purports to represent. He wanted to show that remembering cannot be defined simply as behaving as if a past event occurred, because you can imagine an organism behaving exactly that way with no past event behind it at all. The 5-minute-old world hypothesis was, for Russell, almost a throwaway illustration, a single sentence embedded in a footnote-like aside, disposed of within the paragraph and never returned to. He clearly did not think of it as the seed of a lifelong philosophical puzzle. And yet it escaped the context he built it for, the way certain ideas do, because once you have actually understood what the sentence claims, you cannot easily put it back in its box. It is one of the rare cases in the history of philosophy where a minor, almost incidental remark made in passing by someone occupied with an entirely different question turned out to open a trapdoor beneath a belief so basic that almost no one before him had thought to ask whether it needed defending at all. Every culture that has ever kept a calendar, told a story about its ancestors, or buried its dead with grave goods meant for an afterlife has assumed, without a flicker of doubt, that there is a past stretching behind the present, solid and settled and available in principle to memory and record. Russell, in one sentence, in a book about something else, showed that this assumption, universal as it is, sits on foundations far less secure than anyone had bothered to check. It is worth being precise about what kind of claim this is, because it is easy to round it off into something either weaker or stranger than what Russell actually said. He was not claiming that the universe probably did begin 5 minutes ago. He held no such belief, and neither, in all likelihood, do you, and neither will this exploration ask you to adopt one by the time it is finished. He was not even claiming that the hypothesis is worth taking seriously as a live empirical possibility, the way you might take seriously a genuine scientific hypothesis about, say, the existence of a 10th planet. He was making a purely logical observation that the hypothesis is not self-contradictory, that it does not violate any law of logic, and that no observation available to a person inside such a world could, even in principle, distinguish it from a world with a real deep history. This is a much narrower and, for exactly that reason, a much harder claim to escape. You cannot defeat it by pointing to how absurd or how improbable the scenario sounds, because absurdity and improbability are not logical impossibility, and Russell never claimed anything stronger than logical possibility in the first place. The whole force of the puzzle lies in that narrow gap between could not possibly be true and cannot be ruled out by anything available to you, and almost every unsatisfying popular response to the puzzle turns out, on inspection, to be an attempt to answer the first claim, while the second claim, the one actually being made, walks straight past the response untouched. It helps to make this vivid with an image, because philosophy that stays abstract too long loses its grip on the imagination, and this problem lives or dies by whether you can actually picture it. Imagine a vast diorama, the kind you might find in a natural history museum, a scene frozen behind glass, showing a herd of mammoths crossing an ice age plain, so detailed that individual hairs are rendered on each animal's flank, so convincing that a child presses her face to the glass and asks whether they are really there. The diorama was built last week. The mammoths never lived, never crossed any plain, never left the footprints that seemed to trail off toward a painted horizon. Everything about the scene gestures toward a past, a herd in motion, a moment mid-stride, dust kicked up as if from recent movement, but the entire gesture was constructed forward from nothing in the workshop over a few days by artists arranging fiberglass and paint to imply a history that never occurred. Now imagine that this is not a diorama in a museum but the entire universe, and you are not a child pressing your face to the glass but a figure inside the scene, made of the same fiberglass and paint as the mammoths built 5 minutes ago, to believe you have been walking across this plain your whole life, complete with sore feet and a memory of where you started. The mammoths cannot tell the difference between being real animals with a real history and being propped built to imply one. Could you? This thought experiment did not begin with Russell, even though he gave it its cleanest formulation. Its ancestry runs through a much older family of worries about the reliability of the senses and the reach of certainty, a family that includes Descartes' evil demon, wondering whether an all-powerful deceiver might be feeding him false experiences of an external world that does not exist. But Russell's version is subtly different from Descartes', and the difference matters. Descartes was worried about whether the external world exists at all, right now, as he perceives it, whether the table in front of him is real, whether his own body is real. The 5-minute hypothesis grants all of that. It grants that the world exists right now, in exactly the configuration you perceive. It grants that your body is real, your memories are real mental states, the fossils in the ground are real fossils made of real minerals. What it denies is only their history, not that the fossil exists, but that the animal it seems to record ever lived and died and settled into sediment over millions of years. The 5-minute hypothesis is, in a strange way, a more modest skepticism than Descartes' because it leaves the entire present world untouched and attacks only the temporal depth behind it, the story about how the present came to be this way. And because it is more modest, it turns out to be more resilient. You can answer Descartes with reference to God's non-dissection, or with More's raised hand, or with 100 other strategies that reassert the reliability of present perception. None of those strategies touch Russell's puzzle, because Russell's puzzle does not ask you to trust perception any less than you already do. It asks you to notice that trusting perception fully and completely still leaves the question of the past entirely open. So where does this leave the ordinary confidence you feel about your own history? It leaves it, on reflection, resting not on evidence in the strict logical sense but on something closer to a working assumption, an unexamined default that the mind adopts because the alternative is unlivable rather than because the alternative has been disproven. This is an uncomfortable thing to notice because we like to think of our beliefs about the past as the most secure beliefs we have, more secure, even, than our beliefs about the future, which we readily admit are uncertain and probabilistic. We say things like the past is fixed, the future is open, and we mean this as a contrast between certainty and uncertainty. But Russell's puzzle shows that the fixity of the past and the certainty of our knowledge of it are two entirely different things. The past, if it exists, may well be fixed and unchangeable, but our access to it, right now, is entirely mediated by present states, memories, records, physical traces, and every one of those present states underdetermines its own history. The past could be fixed and real, stretching back billions of years, or it could be 5 minutes deep, and either way, the present moment would look exactly the same to you. Fixity is not the same as knowability. A fact can be perfectly determinate and still be, from where you stand, radically underdetermined by everything available to you. This is the moment to turn to memory more directly, because memory is doing an enormous amount of unexamined work in ordinary life, and the 5-minute hypothesis is really, at bottom, an attack on the epistemic authority of memory. What is memory, philosophically speaking? There are, broadly, two families of theories. The first, sometimes called the causal theory of memory, holds that a genuine memory must be caused, in the right sort of way, by the very event it represents. On this view, my memory of eating breakfast is a real memory only if the breakfast event actually occurred and left a causal trace in my brain that eventually surfaces as this recollection. If the memory arose some other way, implanted by a neuroscientist, generated spontaneously by a freak neural event, or, in our case, created whole at the moment of a 5-minute-old universe's birth, then it is not really a memory at all, on this theory, even though it feels exactly like one. It is what philosophers call a quasi-memory, or a pseudo-memory, something with all the phenomenal furniture of memory but none of the appropriate causal history. It is worth pausing to notice how much philosophical weight the concept of memory has been asked to carry across the history of thought, quite apart from Russell's puzzle, because this history makes the stakes of the puzzle even clearer. John Locke, writing in the 17th century, proposed that personal identity over time, the very thing that makes you the same person today as the person who woke up in your bed this morning, or the child who once lived in your childhood home, is constituted by memory. On Locke's view, you are the same person as some past individual just in case you can, in principle, remember having that individual's experiences from the inside. This is an elegant theory because it explains why bodily continuity alone does not seem to be what matters to us when we imagine our own survival. We care about whether the person waking up tomorrow will remember being us today more than we care about the literal continuity of our cells, most of which will have been replaced many times over across a lifetime in any case. But Locke's theory becomes considerably more unsettling once you have absorbed Russell's puzzle, because it means that personal identity itself, on this influential view, is being cashed out entirely in terms of a psychological relation that we have just shown to be radically underdetermined by anything checkable from the inside. If memory cannot certify its own causal history, then a theory of personal identity built entirely on memory inherits that same vulnerability. You would be, on Locke's account, whoever your memories say you are, and if those memories were fabricated 5 minutes ago, then the person you take yourself to be, the person with a childhood, a family, a history of choices that shaped who you became, might be, in the strictest sense, 5 minutes old, wearing the identity of someone who never actually existed to have those experiences. Modern cognitive science has, in its own way, stumbled onto a smaller-scale version of exactly this worry, and it is worth bringing in briefly because it shows the puzzle is not merely a logical curiosity confined to imagined extreme scenarios. Researchers studying human memory, most famously Elizabeth Loftus and her collaborators, have demonstrated repeatedly that entirely false memories of childhood events that never occurred, implanted through suggestive questioning and repeated imagination exercises, can be constructed in ordinary adult subjects, and that once constructed, these false memories become subjectively indistinguishable from real ones. Subjects report identical confidence, identical vividness, identical emotional coloring, whether recalling an event that actually happened to them or an event that was entirely fabricated in the course of a psychology experiment. This is not a philosopher's imagined scenario. It is a documented, replicated finding about how actual human memory works, and it demonstrates in miniature exactly the structural gap Russell identified in the abstract. The phenomenal character of a memory carries no built-in signature indicating whether it was produced by the event it represents or by some entirely different process. If a memory can be manufactured in a laboratory in an afternoon and become indistinguishable from a memory forged by decades of lived experience, then the idea that an entire life's worth of memories could be manufactured in an instant at the birth of a 5-minute-old universe stops looking like an exotic philosophical fantasy and starts looking like an extrapolation, however extreme, of a mechanism we already know to be real. The gap between the phenomenology of memory and the truth about its origin is not a hypothetical gap. It is a gap that has been measured in ordinary human beings, in ordinary laboratories, and it goes exactly as deep as Russell's puzzle needs it to go. Notice what the causal theory does and does not accomplish. It gives us a definition that distinguishes real memories from fake ones. But it does nothing to help us tell from the inside which kind we are having. The causal theory is a theory about what memory is metaphysically, not a method for verifying, in any particular case, whether the metaphysical conditions are met. You cannot introspect your way to an answer about your memory's causal ancestry, because introspection only reveals the phenomenal character of the state, and the phenomenal character is, by stipulation, identical in both the genuine and the pseudo case. This is precisely the shape of the problem we already identified: a correct theory of what would make the belief true, paired with a total inability to apply that theory from the first-person point of view. It is a bit like being told that a diamond is real only if it was formed by carbon under specific pressures over millions of years, while holding a stone in your hand that is, atom for atom, identical to such a diamond, but was in fact synthesized in a lab yesterday. The definition is fine. The definition does not help you at all when you are staring at the stone. The second family of theories, sometimes grouped under the heading of the memory trace or representational theories, tries a different approach. Instead of tying the correctness of a memory to its causal history, these theories emphasize the internal structure of the memory itself, its coherence with other memories, its integration into a network of related beliefs, its resistance to certain kinds of internal contradiction. On this view, what makes a memory trustworthy is not some invisible causal umbilical cord to the past event, but the way the memory fits, like a puzzle piece, into the larger picture of everything else you believe. This sounds more promising because it seems to offer something you can actually check. You can ask, does this memory cohere with my other memories? Does it fit with the physical evidence around me? But notice that the 5-minute hypothesis has already anticipated this move and swallowed it whole. If the universe began 5 minutes ago, it did not begin with a single stray memory floating in isolation, easily caught out by its failure to cohere with everything else. It began with an entire, internally consistent world, a whole tapestry of memories, all mutually reinforcing, all pointing to the same fictional past, or agreeing with the physical traces around you because the physical traces were created in the same instant, calibrated to match. Coherence is not evidence against the 5-minute hypothesis. Coherence is exactly what a well-constructed 5-minute-old world would have by design, because incoherence is the only thing that would actually be detectable, and so incoherence is the only thing a maximally deceptive scenario would need to avoid. This point deserves emphasis because it is where a lot of casual attempts to dismiss the puzzle go wrong. People often respond to the 5-minute hypothesis by saying something like, but everything fits together so well, the geological record matches the biological record, which matches the astronomical record, which matches written history, surely that coherence is itself evidence that it's all real. But this response mistakes the target of the hypothesis. The hypothesis does not claim that the world is a mess of unrelated fragments. It claims that the world, exactly as coherent and interlocking as it in fact appears, was produced in a single instant rather than through an actual, extended process. The coherence is not a surprising bonus that would be hard to fake. The coherence is the easiest part to build in precisely because coherence is a static structural property, a relationship among things as they are right now, and static structural properties are exactly the kind of thing that can be instantiated instantaneously without any process at all. A single frozen frame can be internally consistent. Consistency does not require duration. It only requires that everything present at one time not contradict everything else present at that same time. And a 5-minute-old universe, engineered or otherwise, could satisfy that requirement just as easily, indeed more easily, than an actual 13-billion-year-old one, because there is no independent process that has to align by luck. Everything is set by fiat all at once to agree. It is worth pausing here to notice the connection between this and a broader feature of empirical reasoning generally, one that will lead us, in a moment, into the second major theme of this exploration, induction. Whenever we reason from present evidence to a conclusion about the unobserved, whether the unobserved is the past, the future, or simply the parts of the world we are not currently looking at, we are relying on some principle that licenses the inference. In the case of memory, the principle is something like states that present themselves with the phenomenal character of memory are, in general, produced by the past events they represent. This is a plausible principle. It is the principle we use every day successfully, without a second thought. But notice that it is not a principle we can verify by appeal to memory itself, on pain of circularity, and it is not a principle that follows from pure logic. It is, instead, an inductive generalization, a claim about how the world usually works, extrapolated from a pattern we have noticed. And this brings us to the second great crack in the foundation, a crack that was mapped out most famously not by Russell but by David Hume 2 centuries earlier, and which turns out to be intimately connected to the 5-minute puzzle in a way that is easy to miss. Hume's problem of induction begins with an innocent-looking question: why do we believe that the future will resemble the past? Every time you assume that bread will nourish you because bread has nourished you before, that the sun will rise tomorrow because it has risen every day of your life, that dropped objects will fall because they always have, you are making an inference from observed cases to unobserved cases. Hume's insight was that this inference cannot be justified by demonstrative reasoning. There is no contradiction in imagining that bread will suddenly poison you tomorrow, or that the sun will fail to rise, however unlikely these outcomes seem. And it cannot be justified by an appeal to past experience either, because the claim we are trying to justify is precisely that past experience is a reliable guide to future experience, and using that very claim to justify itself is circular. We would be arguing the future will resemble the past because the future has always resembled the past, but the second half of that sentence is itself a claim about the future's relationship to the past, the very thing in question. Hume did not conclude that induction is false or that we should abandon it. He concluded something more unsettling, that induction is not, and cannot be, grounded in reason at all. We rely on it because of psychological habit and animal instinct for expecting regularities to continue, not because we have discovered some rational principle that guarantees they will. Here is the connection to Russell's puzzle, and it is a connection that transforms the 5-minute hypothesis from a curious standalone paradox into a symptom of something much larger. When you infer the existence of the past from your present memories, you are relying on an inductive generalization. Memory-like states have, in my experience, tended to correspond to real past events, so this memory-like state probably does too. But notice first that you cannot check whether memory-like states have in your experience corresponded to real past events without already relying on further memories to establish what your past experience of memory have been like, which is circular in exactly the way Hume identified. And notice, second, that even setting the circularity aside, an inductive generalization of this kind only ever gives you a probabilistic conclusion, never a certain one, and worse, it only covers the ordinary run of cases, the cases where nothing exotic is going on. The 5-minute hypothesis is precisely a claim about an exotic case, a single, cosmically unprecedented event, the instantaneous creation of a fully formed world, and induction, by its very nature, is silent about unprecedented events. Induction tells you what usually happens based on a pattern of past cases. It cannot tell you anything reliable about whether this moment, right now, is one of the ordinary cases or the single, unrepeated exception, because by definition there is no pattern of prior 5-minute-old universe creations to draw on. You are asking induction to rule out the one kind of scenario it was never built to address, a scenario in which the entire evidentiary record that induction depends upon was fabricated at a single stroke. It is worth dwelling a little longer on Hume because his argument has a structure that will keep reappearing in slightly different clothing for the rest of this inquiry, and understanding that structure clearly now will save a great deal of confusion later. Hume distinguished between two kinds of reasoning concerning relations of ideas, which includes mathematics and logic, where the denial of a true conclusion produces an outright contradiction, and reasoning concerning matters of fact, which includes essentially all of empirical belief, where the denial of even the best supported conclusion produces no contradiction at all, only surprise. It is not a contradiction to imagine bread failing to nourish you tomorrow, however astonishing it would be. It is not a contradiction to imagine the sun failing to rise. And, crucially for us, it is not a contradiction to imagine that the universe began 5 minutes ago. All three of these denials are, in Hume's terms, matters of fact rather than relations of ideas, and Hume's entire point was that no amount of accumulated experience, however vast, can convert a matter of fact into a relation of ideas, can convert something merely surprising if false into something logically impossible if false. This is precisely why appeals to overwhelming evidence, however psychologically comforting, never fully close the gap the skeptic has identified. The skeptic is not disputing that the past hypothesis is overwhelmingly more probable by ordinary standards. The skeptic is pointing out that overwhelmingly probable and logically necessary are different categories entirely, and that the entire edifice of empirical belief, including belief in the past, has only ever lived in the first category, no matter how firmly it has felt, from the inside, like the second. There is a related and less-known argument, sometimes called the problem of the criterion, traceable to ancient skepticism and revived in modern form by philosophers such as Roderick Hume, that deserves mention here because it names a difficulty lurking underneath everything discussed so far. The problem runs like this: in order to sort our beliefs into the reliable ones and the unreliable ones, we would need some criterion, some rule, for distinguishing genuine knowledge from mere appearance. But how would we ever justify that criterion? If we try to justify it by appeal to particular cases we already recognize as instances of knowledge, we are assuming, without argument, that we can already tell which cases are genuine, which is exactly the ability the criterion was supposed to give us in the first place. And if we try to justify the criterion some other way, independent of any particular cases, it is unclear where such a justification could even come from, since criteria for knowledge are not typically things we discover through observation, they are principles we bring to observation in order to interpret it. This is the same circle Hume traced with induction, dressed in slightly more general clothing, and it explains why the puzzle about the past is not really an isolated oddity that afflicts only claims about history. It is a local instance of a perfectly general structural problem that afflicts any attempt to certify from entirely within our own belief system that the system as a whole is tracking truth rather than merely tracking itself. Before turning to Goodman, it is worth naming the general phenomenon that both Hume's problem and Russell's puzzle turn out to be specific instances of, because seeing the general shape makes the specific cases far less mysterious, even if it does not make them any easier to escape. Philosophers of science call this phenomenon the underdetermination of theory by evidence, and it says, in its broadest form, that for any finite body of observational evidence, there will always be more than one theory, typically infinitely many theories fully compatible with that evidence, and no amount of additional observation, so long as the observations remain finite, can ever whittle the field down to exactly one. This is not a special embarrassment reserved for skeptical hypotheses about the past. It afflicts the whole of empirical science at every level. Given any finite set of data points on a graph, there are infinitely many distinct curves that pass through every single one of those points, diverging wildly beyond the range of the data actually collected, and the choice of which curve to project forward or backward is never forced by the data points themselves. It is always supplemented by some further principle, usually a preference for smoothest simplicity or continuity with well-established background theory. Physicists choosing between competing theories that make identical predictions for every experiment performed so far, historians choosing between competing narratives that account equally well for the surviving documentary record, biologists choosing between competing phylogenetic trees that fit the available fossil and genetic evidence with equal adequacy, all of them face, in a domesticated and less vertiginous form, exactly the situation Russell exposed in its most extreme and pure form. The 5-minute hypothesis is not a strange exception to how empirical reasoning works. It is what happens when you push the ordinary, everyday, usually unnoticed problem of underdetermination all the way to its most extreme possible limits, stripping away every intermediate case until only the starkest possible choice remains: an entire cosmic history, real, versus an entire cosmic history, fabricated an instant ago, with nothing whatsoever in the data to tell them apart. There is a further wrinkle here associated with the philosopher Nelson Goodman that sharpens the problem of induction in a way directly relevant to our theme. Goodman pointed out that induction does not just face the challenge of justifying the inference from past to future, it faces the pride challenge of specifying which patterns in the past are the ones worth projecting forward at all. He illustrated this with his famous invented predicate GRU, meaning green if first observed before some future date, and blue if first observed after that date. Every emerald we have ever seen is compatible with the generalization all emeralds are green, and equally compatible with the generalization all emeralds are GRU. Our past observations do not by themselves tell us which pattern to project. We need some additional principle, some sense of which properties are the natural ones worth generalizing, and that principle cannot itself come from the observations because the observations are equally consistent with wildly different generalizations. Translate this into our context. Your present memories and physical traces are compatible with the generalization the world has a genuine, extended, multi-billion-year past, and equally compatible with the generalization the world came into being 5 minutes ago with the appearance of such a past. The evidence does not privilege one hypothesis over the other any more than the emeralds privilege green over grue. What privileges one hypothesis over the other, if anything does, is not the evidence itself but some further principle we bring to the evidence, a principle about simplicity, about naturalness, about which kinds of explanations we are willing to consider live options at all. And where does that principle come from, and what justifies it? We will come back to this because it turns out to be the closest thing to an actual answer that centuries of epistemology have produced. But first, the trail leads somewhere darker. It is worth remembering, before going further, why Descartes went looking for a demon in the first place, because his motive was constructive rather than destructive, and this matters for how we should read the whole skeptical tradition that follows from him. Descartes was not trying to make anyone despair of knowledge. He was trying to find a method for rebuilding knowledge on foundations so secure that no future doubt could ever shake them again, and his strategy for finding those foundations was to apply the most extreme, most exaggerated doubt he could devise to every one of his existing beliefs, on the theory that whatever survived such an assault would have proven itself genuinely indubitable. The evil demon was a tool, a kind of maximally aggressive stress test, deliberately more paranoid than any doubt a sane person would actually entertain in ordinary life, precisely because Descartes wanted to see what, if anything, could not be shaken even by an adversary of unlimited malicious power. He concluded that exactly one thing survived: the fact of his own thinking in the very moment of doubting could not be doubted away, because the act of doubting is itself an act of thinking, and so doubt pushed all the way to its limit becomes self-certifying at exactly one point, and one point only. Everything else, the external world, his body, the reliability of his senses, and, though Descartes did not frame it quite this way, the reality of his own past remained, at that stage of his inquiry, genuinely up for grabs, awaiting a further argument to reclaim it. It is a humbling fact about the history of philosophy that Descartes' own attempt to reclaim the rest of the world, by way of an argument that a benevolent God would not permit systematic dissection, is now widely regarded as the weakest part of his entire system, resting on premises about God's existence and character that are, if anything, less secure than the beliefs they were meant to rescue. Descartes opened a door that his own resources could not close, and philosophy had been standing in that doorway in one form or another ever since. If memory cannot certify its own accuracy, and induction cannot certify its own reliability, the mind naturally reaches for a wider and more corrosive doubt, and this is the terrain of philosophical skepticism proper, not skepticism about this or that particular belief, but skepticism about whole categories of belief mounted through scenarios explicitly designed to be undetectable from within experience. Descartes' evil demon is the classical ancestor here, a being of unlimited power devoting all its energy to deceiving Descartes about the nature of reality, ensuring that his sensory experiences are systematically false while feeling, from the inside, exactly as true perceptions would feel. The modern descendant of this thought experiment is the brain in a vat. Imagine your brain removed from your body, floating in a vat of nutrient fluid, wired to a supercomputer that stimulates it with electrical signals perfectly matching the signals a normally embodied brain would receive, generating a complete simulated experience of a body, a world, a history that never happened to anybody because there is no body, only a brain and a machine. The brain in the vat believes it is reading these very words on a page or a screen. It believes it has a childhood, a family, a favorite meal, a memory of yesterday. Every one of these beliefs is false, and none of them feels false, because falseness is not a phenomenal quality that beliefs carry around with them. It is a relationship between the belief and the world, and that relationship is invisible from the inside. The 5-minute hypothesis is, in a sense, a more surgical version of the brain in a vat scenario because it does not even require a vat, a demon, or a deceiver with intentions. It requires only a single, brute cosmic fact that the initial state of the universe, whatever caused it, happened to include, among the positions and velocities of its particles, a configuration that we would describe as a fully formed world with the appearance of a deep past. No malicious agent is needed. No conspiracy is needed. Just an initial condition. And this is what makes the 5-minute hypothesis so much harder to dismiss than the demon or the vat, because those scenarios can be waved away, if you like, by observing that they require an implausible amount of engineering, a demon with godlike powers and a taste for elaborate deception, or an advanced civilization capable of sustaining a disembodied brain and simulating an entire world's worth of sensory input. Those scenarios ask you to believe in an elaborate architecture of deception. The 5-minute hypothesis asks you to believe in nothing but a certain arrangement of matter at a certain moment, which is, on the face of it, no stranger a starting point than any other arrangement of matter at any other moment. Every cosmology has to posit some initial condition. Ordinary Big Bang cosmology posits an extraordinarily hot, dense, uniform initial state roughly 13.8 billion years in the past. The 5-minute hypothesis posits an extraordinarily specific, highly structured initial state 5 minutes in the past. Both are, in the most basic sense, just brute facts about how things started. Neither is more natural in some deep metaphysical sense than the other, unless you already have some principle telling you why an early uniform state deserves more credence than a late highly structured one, and identifying that principle, again, turns out to be the crux of the whole matter. There is a genuinely eerie scientific echo of this problem that deserves mention here, because it shows that the 5-minute hypothesis is not merely an armchair curiosity confined to philosophy seminars. It has a cousin in theoretical physics and cosmology called the Boltzmann brain problem, named for the 19th century physicist Ludwig Boltzmann. In certain cosmological models, particularly those involving an eternal or extremely long-lived universe subject to random thermal fluctuations, it turns out to be vastly more probable, over sufficiently long timescales, for a fully functioning, momentarily self-aware brain to spontaneously assemble out of the random jostling of particles in empty space, complete with false memories of an entire life, a false sense of embodiment, a false experience of reading an article just like this one, than it is for an entire ordered galaxy, let alone an entire habitable universe with billions of years of structured history, to arise through the ordinary unfolding of physical law. If you take certain versions of eternal inflation seriously, the statistically typical observer in the universe, if you could survey all observers across all of time and space, would overwhelmingly be one of these freak fluctuation brains popping into existence for a fraction of a second with a head full of false memories, rather than an observer with an actual, extended evolutionary and biographical history like the one you take yourself to have. Physicists tend to treat this implication as an embarrassment, a signal that something has gone wrong with the model, rather than as an actual live possibility about their own nature, and there are serious ongoing debates about how to rule out Boltzmann brain-nominated cosmologies. But notice what this tells us: some of the most rigorous, mathematically precise reasoning available to human beings, applied to our best physical theories, produces exactly Russell's ancient philosophical worry, dressed in the language of statistical mechanics. The 5-minute hypothesis is not a parlor trick. It is a genuine fault line running through both metaphysics and physics, and it does not resolve itself just because we choose not to look at it. A related worry, though it targets slightly different territory, comes from the philosopher Nick Bostrom's simulation argument, which asks us to consider whether advanced civilizations, given enough computing power, would eventually run enormous numbers of detailed simulations of their own ancestral history, populated by simulated minds unaware that they are simulated. If such simulations are ever run in large enough numbers, Bostrom argued, then simulated observers would vastly outnumber the original, non-simulated observers who inhabit the one genuine base-level reality, which means that any given observer, reasoning about their own likely status without further information, ought to assign significant probability to being one of the simulated many rather than one of the non-simulated few. This argument differs from Russell's in an important respect. It does not claim that the simulated world lacks a real causal history altogether, only that the history it presents, however extensive and internally coherent, was generated by a simulation running for however long the simulators chose, which could in principle be started or paused, or its recorded history extended backward by fiat at any moment the simulator's light, including 5 minutes ago, in whatever counts as now for the simulated inhabitants. In this sense, the simulation argument functions almost as a modern, technologically dressed cousin of the 5-minute hypothesis, arrived at from a completely different direction, not through an analysis of memory and logical possibility, as Russell's was, but through probabilistic reasoning about the likely distribution of minds across possible base and simulated realities. That two such different lines of reasoning, one from armchair philosophy of mind and one from speculative computer science, converge on structurally similar conclusions about the unreliability of felt history is itself worth noticing. It suggests that the vulnerability Russell identified is not an artifact of one particular way of framing the problem. It is a vulnerability built into the very relationship between present experience and past fact, one that keeps resurfacing no matter which direction you approach it from. So where does this leave us? We have a puzzle that cannot be dissolved by better evidence, because the very concept of evidence for the past presupposes exactly the kind of inference the puzzle calls into question. We have memory, which turns out to be a present state incapable of certifying its own historical accuracy from the inside. We have induction, which turns out to rest on an unprovable assumption about the uniformity of nature, an assumption that is itself powerless to address genuinely unprecedented scenarios like a world beginning mid-stride. And we have a family of skeptical scenarios, the demon, the vat, the 5-minute universe, the Boltzmann brain, that are all, structurally, the same move. Take the totality of present experience and show that it is compatible with radically different and radically less comfortable stories about its origin. If this were the end of the inquiry, it would be a bleak place to stop, a kind of intellectual vertigo with no railing to hold on to. But it is not the end, because philosophers have not simply thrown up their hands. They have asked a further, more constructive question. Given that certainty about the past is unavailable, what, if anything, can still be said in its favor? And this question belongs to epistemology in the fullest sense, not the theory of what we can be certain of, but the theory of what makes a belief reasonable, justified, or rational to hold, even in the absence of certainty. Before turning to the specifically epistemological responses, it is worth pausing on one more historical figure whose work bears on this puzzle in a strange, oblique way: Immanuel Kant. Kant did not address the 5-minute hypothesis, which had not yet been formulated in his lifetime, but he did something that turns out to be deeply relevant to it, which was to ask what time itself actually is, metaphysically speaking, and to give an answer that unsettles the whole framing of Russell's puzzle from underneath. Kant argued that time is not a feature of the world as it is in itself, independent of any observer, but rather a form of intuition, a structure that the mind itself imposes on experience in the very act of experiencing anything at all. On Kant's view, you do not perceive objects and then, separately, notice that they are arranged in a temporal order. Rather, temporal ordering is part of the very apparatus your mind uses to have experience of objects in the first place, built into the architecture of cognition rather than discovered as a feature of the external world. If Kant is right about this, then the 5-minute hypothesis takes on a strange new coloring, because it is not simply asking whether a certain quantity of actual, mind-independent time has elapsed before this moment. It is asking a question about the structure of experience itself, phrased as though it were a question about the external world, when the temporal depth in question might be, at least in part, a contribution of the experiencing mind rather than a fact straightforwardly out there to be gotten right or wrong. This does not dissolve the puzzle. You can still ask coherently whether the causal processes that produced your present mental state, whatever role your mind's own temporal framework plays in structuring that state, extend back through actual physical history or not, but it does complicate the naive picture in which the past is simply a stretch of pre-existing time sitting out there, waiting to be verified or falsified, the way you might verify or falsify the existence of a distant object. Kant's move here is characteristic of a certain philosophical instinct that will recur throughout the rest of this inquiry when a question proves permanently unanswerable using the tools normally available for answering questions. One live option is not to work harder at answering it, but to ask whether the question was well posed in the first place, given what we now understand about the nature of the mind that is asking it. The first major epistemological response worth considering is foundationalism, the view that knowledge is structured like a building, with some beliefs serving as a foundation, self-evident or directly given in experience, requiring no further justification, and other beliefs built on top of that foundation through valid inference. Classical foundationalists, including Descartes himself in his more constructive moments, hoped to identify some class of beliefs so secure that they could not be doubted even by the most aggressive skeptical hypothesis, and then to show how the rest of our knowledge, including our knowledge of the past, could be derived from that unshakable base. The trouble, as we have already seen in detail, is that the 5-minute hypothesis specifically targets the inferential step from present foundations to past conclusions. Even granting the foundationalist everything they want about the certainty of present experience, granting that you cannot be wrong about the fact that you are, right now, having a memory-like experience with such and such phenomenal content, this certainty does not transfer to the further claim that the experience was caused by an actual past event. The foundation is secure, but the building built on top of it, specifically the wing of the building labeled the past, turns out to require a beam that foundationalism cannot supply. This is not a flaw specific to bad foundationalist theories, it is a structural limit on what foundationalism, as a general strategy, can accomplish, because the inferential move from present appearance to past reality is exactly the move that no amount of certainty about present appearances can underwrite. A different family of responses associated with coherentism tries to abandon the image of a foundation altogether. On a coherentist view, a belief is justified not by resting on some indubitable bedrock, but by fitting well with the rest of one's belief system, by being woven into a web of mutually supporting commitments, each one lending and receiving support from its neighbors, with no single belief serving as an unquestionable starting point. This picture has real attractions. It matches, in some ways, how actual reasoning works. We rarely justify a belief by tracing it back to an indubitable axiom. We justify it by showing how it fits with everything else we have reason to accept. And it seems, at first, better suited to handle the 5-minute hypothesis because coherentism does not need to find some magical bridge from present certainty to past fact. It can simply say that the belief in an extended past coheres beautifully with everything else we believe, and that coherence is precisely what justification consists in. But we have already seen the sharp edge of this response back when we discussed the memory trace theory. Coherence is exactly what a 5-minute-old, fully formed world would exhibit by hypothesis, since a maximally coherent world is precisely what an instantaneous act of world formation, however it might occur, would need to produce in order to be undetectable. If coherentism says that the mark of justified belief is fitting seamlessly into an internally consistent picture, then coherentism, taken at face value, offers no resources at all for distinguishing a genuinely ancient, coherent universe from a 5-minute-old, equally coherent one, since both are, by construction, maximally coherent. Coherentism explains why we do not notice any internal tension in our belief that the past is real. It does nothing to explain why that belief is actually true, or even more likely to be true than its 5-minute rival. This is a sobering result because it suggests that the two most influential structures in the entire history of epistemology, building a foundation or weaving a web, both fail to give the past hypothesis any special advantage over its rival. And this failure is not an accident or an oversight in the theories. It reflects something true and important about the situation itself. Any theory of justification that operates entirely on the internal features of a belief system, its foundations, its coherence, its internal consistency, will be blind to a threat that operates entirely on the external, causal historical relationship between the belief system and the world that produced it. This observation points toward a third major approach in epistemology, one that shifts the question away from the internal structure of belief and toward the actual causal process that produces belief: reliabilism. Reliabilism holds, roughly, that a belief is justified or counts as knowledge if it is produced by a cognitive process that is, as a matter of fact, reliable, a process that tends to produce true beliefs across the range of situations in which it typically operates. On this view, your memory is a source of justified belief not because you can prove from the armchair that it is trustworthy, but because, as a matter of empirical fact about how memory works in creatures like you, memory-forming processes are generally reliable, generally tracking real past events, generally producing accurate representations of what actually happened. This sounds promising because it locates justification in the actual truth-tracking success of a process rather than in some internal feature the believer has to certify from the inside. But notice the shape of the problem returning in a new guise. How do we know that memory is, in fact, a reliable process? We know this, if we know it at all, by checking memory's track record, by comparing past memories against independent confirmation and finding a pattern of accuracy. But every such check is itself either an act of memory or dependent on records and traces whose accuracy is exactly what is in question, or, in the very specific case of the 5-minute hypothesis, simply inapplicable because there is no track record to check at all if the track record itself was fabricated 5 minutes ago along with everything else. Reliabilism is an excellent theory of what justification consists in for creatures embedded in an ordinary, non-adversarial world where cognitive processes really have had the chance to prove themselves over time. It has almost nothing to say to a creature who cannot rule out, from where it stands, that it has no track record at all, only the appearance of one. There is one more mainstream epistemological strategy worth examining before we turn to the more radical responses, and it goes by the name of contextualism. Contextualist epistemologists, including Keith de Rose and David Lewis among others, propose that the word know does not pick out a single fixed standard across every context in which it is used, but rather shifts its meaning subtly depending on what is conversationally at stake and which alternative possibilities are being actively considered. In an ordinary conversation, when a friend asks whether you know that you had breakfast this morning, the relevant standards for knowing are relatively relaxed because no one in that conversational context is seriously entertaining exotic alternatives like a 5-minute-old universe. The friend simply wants to know whether you ate, and by the standards appropriate to that everyday context, you do know it straightforwardly without any hedging. But once a skeptical hypothesis like Russell's have been explicitly raised and taken seriously, as we have been doing throughout this very inquiry, the contextualist says that the standards for knowing shift upward because the skeptical alternative is now a live option under active consideration, and against that heightened standard it becomes true to say that you do not know, strictly speaking, that the world existed 5 minutes ago, since you cannot rule out the alternative that is now explicitly on the table. On this view, both the confident claim to knowledge in ordinary conversation and the skeptical denial of knowledge in a philosophy seminar can be true at the same time, because they are implicitly governed by different standards attached to different conversational contexts, rather than genuinely contradicting one another the way they would appear to if no meant exactly the same thing in both settings. This is an elegant way of explaining why skeptical arguments feel so compelling while we are in the middle of considering them, and yet seem to lose all their grip the moment we walk out of the room and return to ordinary life, not because we have refuted them, and not because we have simply forgotten about them, but because the very act of stepping back into an ordinary context changes which standard of knowledge is operative, and by that ordinary standard the skeptical alternative was never a serious threat to begin with. Critics of contextualism worry that this explanation is too convenient, that it lets the skeptic win every argument on the skeptic's own turf while allowing everyone else to shrug and walk away unbothered the moment the conversation ends, which looks less like a solution to the puzzle and more like a sophisticated way of describing our tendency to stop worrying about it. Whether or not contextualism ultimately succeeds as a theory, it does capture something true and worth keeping in view, that the sense of vertigo produced by Russell's puzzle is real and appropriate within the frame of the puzzle itself, without that vertigo being a good reason to reorganize the whole of ordinary life around a standard of certainty that no context outside the philosophy seminar has ever actually demanded. At this point, it might seem as though every avenue in classical epistemology dead-ends against the same wall, and in a sense this is exactly right, and it is worth resisting the temptation to paper over that fact with false comfort. But there is a different kind of response available, one that does not try to defeat the 5-minute hypothesis on its own terms by finding some clever piece of evidence or some overlooked inferential move that rules it out, but instead questions whether it needs to be defeated on those terms at all. This response has several versions developed by different philosophers for different purposes, but they share a family resemblance, and it is worth walking through the 2 or 3 most important versions carefully because they represent, arguably, the most mature and honest answer that philosophy has managed to produce. The first version comes from G.E. Moore, who responded to broad skeptical scenarios not by trying to refute them on their own logical terms, but by pointing out that any skeptical argument, however airtight its premises might look in isolation, will always have a conclusion far less certain than some ordinary claim we are far more confident of than we are of any of the argument's premises. Moore's famous example involved holding up his 2 hands and declaring, "Here is one hand, and here is another," as a way of insisting that he was more certain of the existence of his hands than he could ever be of the truth of the abstract skeptical premises that would be required to deny it. Applied to our puzzle, the Moorean move would run something like this: any argument for the 5-minute hypothesis, however logically valid, will have as one of its premises something like no present evidence can ever, even in principle, favor one cosmic history over another, and Moore would say that we are, as a matter of brute rational fact, more confident that we had breakfast this morning than we are of that abstract epistemological premise, however plausible the premise sounds when stated in the isolation of a philosophy seminar. This is not a refutation in the strict logical sense. It does not show where the skeptical argument goes wrong, and Moore himself was candid that he could not point to the exact flaw. It is instead a kind of reversal of the burden of proof, an insistence that when a highly abstract argument collides with an extremely well-entrenched ordinary belief, rationality does not automatically side with the abstract argument just because it is more recently constructed or more cleverly stated. Many philosophers have found this response unsatisfying precisely because it seems to dodge the argument rather than engage it, but many others have found it to be, in the end, the only honest thing to say, that certain background convictions are so deeply woven into the possibility of thought and action that no argument, however valid its individual steps appear, should be allowed to override them, and that treating every abstract argument as automatically more authoritative than lived conviction is itself an unexamined and rather strange epistemic policy. A related but importantly different response comes from Ludwig Wittgenstein in his late notebooks published as Uncertainty, written in the final months of his life and prompted in part by his engagement with exactly this Morean strategy. Wittgenstein's insight was subtler than More's. He suggested that certain propositions, the earth has existed for a long time, I have two hands, my name is such and such, do not function, in our actual practice of reasoning and speaking, as ordinary empirical claims that we have investigated and confirmed through evidence at all. Instead, they function as what he called hinges, fixed points that our practices of doubting and confirming and reasoning all turn on, the way a door turns on its hinges without the hinges themselves being subject to the same kind of scrutiny that the door's swinging motion is. You cannot doubt whether the earth has existed for a long time in the same way you can doubt whether it will rain tomorrow, Wittgenstein suggested, because the entire framework of evidence gathering, hypothesis testing, and rational belief revision that you would use to investigate the rain question already presupposes, silently, in the background, that the earth has a history stable enough for such investigations to make sense. To doubt the hinge is not to make one more move within the game of evidence and inference, it is to threaten the game itself, to remove the board on which the pieces sit. This is a genuinely different kind of move than More's, because More was still operating within the ordinary framework of weighing one claim's certainty against another's. Wittgenstein was suggesting that some claims are not in the business of being weighed at all, they are the precondition for weighing anything. On this view, the 5-minute hypothesis is not false, exactly, and it is not unanswerable, exactly. It is something closer to a move that cannot be coherently made from within the practice of asking and answering questions about evidence, because the practice of asking about evidence for the past already assumes, as its hinge, that there is a past robust enough to have evidence about. Radical doubt about the hinge does not defeat the game, it steps outside the conditions that make the game, including the very activity of philosophical argument, intelligible in the first place. There is something genuinely liberating in the Wittgensteinian move if you let it sink in properly, because it reframes the entire puzzle. It suggests that the demand for evidence that the past exists is, in a certain sense, a demand that cannot be met, not because the evidence is hidden or elusive, but because the demand is malformed, like asking for the physical location of the number 7 or asking what color justice is. It is not that we lack the resources to answer, it is that the question, pushed to this extreme, has quietly left the territory where answers of the kind we want are even the right kind of thing to look for. This does not mean the 5-minute hypothesis is meaningless or should never have been raised. Raising it was enormously valuable because it revealed, with total clarity, exactly how deep the hinge goes and exactly how much of ordinary reasoning depends on never having to defend it. But having revealed that, the appropriate response may not be to keep demanding a justification that the situation cannot, even in principle, supply, but instead to recognize that we have located a boundary condition on rational inquiry itself, a place where inquiry runs out not because it has failed, but because it has reached the ground it was always standing on. A third and more pragmatic response, associated loosely with the American pragmatist tradition and thinkers like William James and Charles Peirce, takes yet another angle. Rather than trying to defeat the skeptical hypothesis on epistemic grounds, the pragmatist asks a different question: what practical difference would it make to believe one way or the other? If there is genuinely no observation, no experiment, no possible experience that could distinguish a 5-minute-old universe with fabricated history from a 13-billion-year-old universe with a real one, then the pragmatist suggests that the distinction, whatever its status as an abstract metaphysical possibility, is empirically and practically empty. Two hypotheses that make exactly the same predictions about every possible future observation are not, from a pragmatic standpoint, meaningfully different hypotheses at all. They are the same hypothesis wearing two different metaphysical labels. This is not a claim that the past definitely, metaphysically exists in the deep sense the skeptic worries about. It is a kind of principled refusal to treat a difference that makes no difference as a difference worth losing sleep over. You should act, plan, and reason exactly the same way whether the universe is 5 minutes old or 13 billion years old, because every future experience you might have is predicted identically by both hypotheses, given that both agree completely about the present state of everything, including your memories and beliefs about the future. If two theories are permanently and completely indistinguishable in every observable respect forever, the pragmatist suggests that continuing to agonize over which one is really true is not a mark of philosophical rigor but a kind of category error, mistaking a question with no possible empirical purchase for a question that matters. It is worth being careful here, because the pragmatist move can sound, at first, like a dodge, a way of declaring the question unimportant simply because it is inconvenient, and that is not quite what is being claimed. William James, developing this line of thought, most fully distinguished between questions that are live, forced, and momentous for a given thinker, and questions that are none of these things, and he argued that our ordinary standards of rational belief formation were never actually built to handle every logically conceivable alternative with equal seriousness, only the alternatives that could, in principle, make some difference to how we act, feel, or plan. A hypothesis that agrees with its rival about literally every future observation, every possible experiment, every conceivable consequence for action, is not a hypothesis you can be pragmatically irrational for setting aside, James would say, because pragmatic rationality is precisely the discipline of allocating belief and doubt according to what could possibly matter for a life that has to be lived forward, not backward, through an uncertain and unfolding present. This does not mean the 5-minute hypothesis is stupid, or that Russell was wasting his time, or that thinking hard about it, as we have been doing, is a pointless exercise. The exercise has been valuable precisely because it forced into view assumptions that usually operate silently beneath the surface of ordinary belief, and seeing them clearly is its own kind of gain, independent of whether it changes how you should act tomorrow morning. But there is a difference between valuing a question for what it reveals about the architecture of your own thinking, and treating that question as though it demanded an answer before you could, in good conscience, trust the antibiotics you took yesterday, or keep a promise you made last week, or grieve the loss of someone you loved. James's insight, essentially, is that these two kinds of value need not be conflated, and that a great deal of needless philosophical anguish comes precisely from conflating them, from treating a permanently undecidable metaphysical question as though it carried the same practical urgency as a genuinely open empirical one. Charles Peirce, working alongside James in this same pragmatist tradition, added a further piece that connects directly back to what we have already said about explanation. Peirce argued that the entire meaning of a concept, and by extension the entire content of a belief, is exhausted by the sum of its practical, conceivable effects, a view he called the pragmatic maxim. Applied here, the maxim suggests that if the concept the universe is 13 billion years old and the concept the universe is 5 minutes old but perfectly arranged to mimic 13 billion years of history, have identical practical effects in every conceivable respect down to the last observable consequence, then the two concepts have for Peirce an identical meaning in the only sense that meaning can ultimately cash out. This is a stronger and more controversial claim than James's more modest point about where to direct our attention, because it suggests not merely that the difference between the two hypotheses does not matter practically, but that there may be no further difference of genuine content between them at all, once every possible observable consequence have been accounted for and exhausted. Not every philosopher have been willing to follow Peirce this far, and there are good reasons for hesitation. It seems to many that there really is a further fact, a further truth about how the world actually got here, even if that further fact makes no practical difference to anyone, and reducing meaning entirely to practical consequence risks eliminating a distinction that our ordinary sense of what really happened refuses to let go of. But even short of accepting Peirce's full pragmatic theory of meaning, his maxim performs a useful diagnostic function here. It isolates, with unusual precision, exactly how much of our ordinary conviction about the deep past is doing genuine explanatory and predictive work, and how much of it is, strictly speaking, idle, a further metaphysical flourish added on top of the explanatorily low-bearing parts of the belief, a flourish we may be entitled to keep on other grounds, but should not mistake for something that our evidence, our reasoning, or our practical life actually requires. It is worth noting an important companion to the pragmatist response, one that connects back to the Goodman puzzle about Grew and Green, the appeal to simplicity, sometimes formalized as Occam's razor, the principle that among hypotheses equally compatible with the evidence, we ought to prefer the one that posits less, that requires fewer and less arbitrary assumptions. The 5-minute hypothesis, on inspection, is a spectacularly complicated hypothesis dressed up to look simple. It might sound simple to say the universe began 5 minutes ago, but unpacking what that requires reveals enormous unmotivated complexity. It requires that the initial state of the universe include an almost inconceivably specific arrangement of matter, precisely calibrated to produce fossils that look like they recorded millions of years of evolution that never happened, light that looks like it traveled for billions of years from stars it never left, brains with intricate memory traces encoding elaborate lives never lived, documents and artifacts bearing consistent internal dates and cross-references to other documents, none of which were ever actually written in sequence. Compare this to the ordinary hypothesis, which requires only that the universe's history actually unfolded the way the traces suggest it did. Fossils record real animals because real animals really died and were really preserved. Light took billions of years to arrive because it really traveled that whole distance. Memories exist because the events they represent really happened and left a causal trace. The ordinary hypothesis requires one thing: normal causation operating over time. The 5-minute hypothesis requires, in effect, an act of staggering, purposeless, and entirely unexplained fine-tuning ex nihilo, and offers no candidate at all for why such a specific configuration, rather than any of the infinite other configurations a 5-minute-old universe might have had, should have obtained. Simplicity, understood this way, is not merely an aesthetic preference for tidy theories. It functions as a genuine tiebreaker precisely in situations, like this one, where the evidence itself cannot adjudicate because it gives us a principled, non-arbitrary reason to weight our credence toward the hypothesis that does not require an unexplained miracle of specification at its starting point. Is this a complete answer? It is worth being honest about its limits. The appeal to simplicity does not prove, with logical certainty, that the past is real. Nothing does, and nothing can, and by now it should be clear why the demand for that kind of proof was never satisfiable in principle, given the structure of the problem, no matter how the inquiry proceeded. What the appeal to simplicity offers instead is a way of understanding why it is rational, not certain, but rational, to proceed as though the past is real, even in full awareness that certainty is unavailable. This is, in fact, how virtually all of empirical reasoning works once you look closely at it, and this is perhaps the deepest lesson the 5-minute hypothesis has to teach beyond its own specific content. We do not have certainty that the sun will rise tomorrow, that other minds exist, that the external world is not a simulation, that our senses are not systematically deceiving us in some way we have never detected. In every one of these cases, philosophers going back centuries have shown, with the same rigor Russell applied to the past, that the alternative skeptical hypothesis cannot be logically excluded by the evidence available. And yet we do not, most of us, live paralyzed by this fact because we have gradually learned, as a species and as individuals, to distinguish between the demand for logical certainty, which is almost never available anywhere in empirical life, and the demand for reasonable, well-grounded, simplicity-respecting belief, which is available almost everywhere, including here. There is one more thread worth pulling before we let this inquiry rest, because it returns us to where we began with Russell himself, and it concerns a method of reasoning that has become increasingly central to modern epistemology and modern science alike: inference to the best explanation. This is, in a sense, the constructive positive counterpart to the negative work Occam's razor does. Rather than merely penalizing complexity, inference to the best explanation asks us to survey the available hypotheses that could account for our present evidence and to accept provisionally whichever hypothesis would, if true, make the evidence least surprising, most expected, most naturally accounted for, not the hypothesis that is merely compatible with the evidence, since infinitely many wild hypotheses are always compatible with any finite body of evidence, but the hypothesis that genuinely explains it, that renders it unsurprising rather than a brute, unexplained coincidence. Consider, one more time, the fossil record, the light from distant stars, the layered strata of rock, the consistent radiometric dating across independent methods, the mutual corroboration of geology, biology, astronomy, and human written history, all converging on a single coherent picture of an ancient, gradually unfolding universe. Under the hypothesis of a real, extended past, this convergence is exactly what we should expect, because all these different lines of evidence are, on that hypothesis, causally connected to the same underlying reality they are jointly describing. They agree because they are all windows onto the same actual history. Under the 5-minute hypothesis, this convergence is a complete and total coincidence, requiring that an initial state formed by whatever unspecified process just happened to arrange billions of independent details, from the isotope ratios in ancient rock to the precise gaps in the fossil record to the exact temperature of the cosmic microwave background, into a configuration that mimics, down to the finest available measurement, what an actual ancient history would have produced, without there being any actual history to explain why. Inference to the best explanation says prefer the hypothesis that explains the convergence over the hypothesis that merely accommodates it as an unexplained brute coincidence, because explanation, not mere logical compatibility, is the true engine of rational belief. It is worth dwelling on a single concrete case to feel the force of this properly, because the abstract phrase convergence of independent evidence can slide past without registering its actual weight. Consider the dating of a particular ancient tree ring sequence against a particular layer of volcanic ash, against a particular measurement of carbon-14 decay, against a particular record of a solar eclipse mentioned in an ancient astronomical text, against the orbital mechanics used to calculate when that eclipse would actually have been visible from that location on Earth. These are not 4 versions of the same measurement. They are 4 entirely different methods developed by different disciplines, using different instruments, resting on different physical principles, with no built-in reason to agree with one another at all, unless they are all, in fact, independently detecting features of one and the same real historical event. When the eclipse calculated from orbital mechanics falls on the very day recorded in the ancient text, and that day falls within the range given by the tree ring and ash layer dating, the ordinary hypothesis explains this alignment immediately and without residue. Of course, independent methods converge on the same date, because there really was one date, one actual eclipse, one actual moment in a real unfolding history, and each method is simply a different window onto that same fixed fact. The 5-minute hypothesis, by contrast, must treat this alignment as an unexplained coincidence baked into the initial conditions. The ash layer, the tree rings, the ancient text, and the orbital positions of the sun and moon all happen, quite by chance, or by some unspecified act of arrangement, to agree with one another, despite having no actual causal connection to a real eclipse or to each other. Multiply this single case by the millions of similar convergences across geology, biology, linguistics, genetics, and archaeology, each one independently confirming the others, and the improbability compounds without limit. This is not proof, in Russell's strict logical sense, and it was never going to be. but it is the clearest possible illustration of why inference to the best explanation carries the weight it does, not because it forecloses the skeptical possibility, which remains formally exactly as open as it always was, but because it identifies with total precision what the skeptical possibility actually costs you if you adopt it, an ever-multiplying pile of unexplained coincidences, one for every independent line of evidence humanity has ever developed, all of them resolved instantly and for free by the single, unified assumption that the past you seem to remember is the past that actually occurred. This is perhaps the most satisfying place to arrive, not because it delivers the certainty the mind instinctively craves when confronted with a puzzle like this, but because it honestly describes the kind of creatures we are and the kind of knowledge available to creatures like us. We are not, and have never been, in the business of achieving logical certainty about matters of empirical fact. That standard was always a mirage, visible from a distance but receding the closer you approach it, in every domain of inquiry, not merely in this one. What we are in the business of, and what we have gotten remarkably good at over the collective history of human thought, is constructing explanations that render the patterns we observe intelligible rather than mysterious, and calibrating our confidence to the explanatory power of the best available account rather than to an impossible standard of état proof. The 5-minute hypothesis will never be refuted in the sense of being shown to be logically impossible or definitively falsified by some clever experiment. It remains, and will always remain, a live logical possibility, exactly as Russell said. But living with an unrefuted possibility is not the same as living without warrant for belief, and philosophy's great contribution here, across 2,500 years of grappling with skepticism in its many forms, has been to carefully distinguish those two things, so that the mere unrefutability of a skeptical scenario stops functioning as a trump card against the belief it targets, and starts functioning instead as what it actually is, a permanent, humbling reminder of the limits of certainty sitting quietly in the background while ordinary, well-grounded explanation respecting belief goes on doing the actual work of guiding thought and action. So what, in the end, counts as evidence for the past? Not proof, because proof was never on offer, not here and not anywhere in the empirical world. Not memory alone, because memory is a present state incapable of certifying its own history from the inside. Not coherence alone, because a perfectly coherent world is exactly what a perfectly fabricated one would also have to be. What counts, in the only sense available to creatures who reason the way we do, is explanatory power weighed against simplicity, the recognition that a real, extended, causally continuous past explains the totality of your present experience in all its intricate, cross-corroborating detail, far more naturally than any hypothesis requiring that detail to have been arranged instantaneously and inexplicably moments ago. This is not a knockdown argument. It does not banish the 5-minute hypothesis to the realm of the strictly impossible. It does something more modest and, in a way, more honest. It gives you a principled reason to hold your belief in the past the way a careful thinker should hold any empirical belief, not as an item of certainty, immune to all conceivable doubt, but as the best explanation currently available, adopted provisionally, defended not because it cannot be doubted, but because doubting it, on the evidence actually before you, would require preferring an unexplained coincidence to an explanation, and that preference, whatever else can be said about it, has never once been the mark of a rational mind. It is tempting, having traced the argument this far, to ask whether all of this trouble was necessary in the first place, whether a puzzle this resistant to resolution was worth the centuries of attention that Russell, and Hume before him, and Descartes before Hume, and the ancient Pehinists before Descartes poured into it. But notice what the inquiry has actually delivered, quite apart from whether it settled the original question. It has forced a far more precise accounting of what different kinds of belief actually rest on than ordinary life ever requires. Before this inquiry, you likely held your belief in the past the way you hold your belief that the chair beneath you will not collapse automatically, without examination, backed by nothing you could articulate if pressed, and entirely functional for exactly that reason. There is nothing wrong with holding beliefs that way most of the time. A mind that paused to justify every belief before acting on it would never act at all. But there is a particular kind of intellectual honesty available only to a mind that has, at least once, gone looking for the foundation beneath an assumption, this base it, and found, instead of solid ground, a structure of provisional inference resting on further provisional inference, all the way down, with no bedrock layer of pure certainty waiting at the bottom. That discovery does not weaken the belief in any practical sense. If anything, it strengthens your relationship to it because you now hold the belief for reasons you have actually inspected, rather than for no reason at all beyond the fact that everyone around you holds it too and no alternative had ever occurred to you. This is, in miniature, the entire value of epistemology as a discipline, not that it manufactures certainties the way engineering manufactures bridges, but that it teaches a mind to know the difference between a belief it holds because it has earned the right to hold it provisionally and revisably on the best available grounds, and a belief it holds simply because holding it has never yet been interrupted by a hard enough question. And so you return, at the end of this inquiry, to the same memory you started with, the sentence you read a few minutes ago, the mental image of the sentence before that, the whole quiet architecture of a life you take yourself to have lived. Nothing about that architecture has been proven, in the strict sense the philosophers we have followed here would recognize as proof. But something has changed, even so, in how you are entitled to hold it. You now know exactly where the ground gives way, exactly how deep the questioning can go before it stops being a question about evidence and becomes a question about the very possibility of asking for evidence at all. Think back, for a moment, to the diorama, the mammoths frozen mid-stride behind museum glass, built last week to imply a herd that never crossed any plain. There was one thing that diorama could never do, no matter how skillfully its makers worked, and it is worth naming precisely because it is the one thing that separates your situation, whatever else remains uncertain about it, from the mammoths. The diorama cannot ask whether it is a diorama. It has no vantage point from which to wonder about its own history, no capacity to trace the implications of its own fabricated footprints back to a suspicion about their origin, no faculty capable of formulating Russell's sentence and turning it over, worrying at it, following it all the way down through memory and induction and the failures of every epistemological system built to rescue it. Whatever you are, fabricated 5 minutes ago or extended backward through 13 billion years of unbroken causal history, you are the kind of thing that can ask the question, weigh the answers, notice where the answers run out, and choose with open eyes how to proceed from there. That capacity does not settle whether the past is real, but it does mean you are not simply an inert prop arranged to imply a history in the way the mammoths are. You are something that can, at minimum, examine its own implication, and examining it, rather than passively wearing it, may be the closest thing to an answer this particular mystery was ever going to yield. There is an old image, common to detective fiction, of the investigator standing in a room at the end of a case, having gathered every clue, interviewed every witness, and arrived, finally, not at absolute proof beyond every conceivable doubt, but at the one explanation that accounts for everything without remainder, the one story into which every scattered fact fits without strain or special pleading. The detective in these stories rarely has a signed confession, rarely has a video recording of the crime itself, rarely has anything that would satisfy the standard of certainty a mathematician would demand of a proof. What the detective has is something more modest and, for exactly that reason, more honest, an explanation good enough to act on, arrived at by ruling out the alternatives not because they were logically impossible, but because they left too much unexplained, too many coincidences unaccounted for, too many threads dangling loose. This has been, from the first paragraph to this one, an inquiry conducted in exactly that spirit. The mystery was never going to end with a signed confession from the universe, some final unimpeachable proof that the past is real, arriving to settle the matter beyond all possible doubt. That kind of ending was never available, not to Russell, not to Hume, not to anyone who has ever asked a question this deep about the grounds of empirical belief. What was available, and what this inquiry has tried to earn honestly rather than assume, is the detective's kind of ending, not certainty, but the best explanation left standing once every rival has been examined and found wanting, adopted with full awareness of its provisional status, held with a particular clear-eyed confidence that comes not from the absence of doubt but from having looked directly at the doubt and found, on the other side of it, still the same conclusion you started with, now understood far more precisely than before. So the case does not close with a verdict beyond all possible appeal. It closes the way every honest case in empirical life closes, with an explanation that has earned its keep by making sense of everything on the table, and with the quiet, permanent acknowledgement that some further doubt, logically speaking, will always remain technically available to anyone determined enough to keep raising it. You can hold your past and the whole unbroken sense of a self moving through time that comes with it, not as an unquestionable fact handed down from on high, but as the best story going, chosen not because every rival has been destroyed, but because it is the only one that makes sense of everything, and because making sense in the end, however incomplete, however provisional, is the only kind of home the mind has ever really had. The sentence you read at the very beginning of this exploration is behind you now, sitting wherever the past sits, real or fabricated, settled or perpetually unsettlable. And you, whoever and whatever you turn out to be, 5 minutes old or considerably older, are still here, turning the question over, which is itself, perhaps, the only kind of evidence a mind like yours was ever going to get.